The house was shrouded in silence when Mia returned in the evening. The atmosphere was still, disturbed only by the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. She tossed her keys onto the kitchen table, took off her shoes, and sighed deeply, savoring the relief after a long day. All her thoughts were only about how to get to bed as quickly as possible. However, as she walked down the hallway, she noticed a dim light coming from under the guest room door. Max, her uncle, had apparently arrived during the day and settled in there. He had warned that he might have to stay for a couple of days. Usually, Max preferred hotels, but this time he decided to stay overnight at his niece's place. Mia stopped at the door, biting her lip in indecision. She knew she should just go to her room, but something inside her made her stop and push the door open. Before her, on the bed, lay Max, his long body comfortably stretched out on the blanket. His hand covered his face, and his breathing was deep and even. At that moment, he seemed more peaceful than ever. On his face was a reflection of tranquility, and Mia involuntarily smiled. But it wasn't this that caught her attention. Her gaze stopped on how his shirt was slightly pulled up, revealing his toned stomach and the belt of his jeans. Mia's heart began to beat faster, and she froze, unable to look away. She knew she should leave the room, but something inexplicable held her in place. An unpredictable attraction, like a call from the depths of her mind, made her step closer. Her fingers involuntarily began to tremble, as if they themselves were eager to touch his skin. Step by step, she approached the bed, holding her breath, as if afraid to disturb the silence. Max looked so peaceful that it was almost hypnotic. Mia didn't understand what exactly kept her in that room. Maybe it was the dim light, highlighting the sharp features of his face, or the barely perceptible scent of his cologne that still lingered in the air. Perhaps fatigue mixed with her inner emotions, clouding her consciousness and pushing her to reckless actions. She stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her thoughts racing between curiosity and caution. The room was bathed in a soft, golden light from the bedside lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. The air was filled with a light, soothing scent of lavender from the diffuser in the corner. The ticking of the clock became louder, stretching each second into eternity. Mia took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She knew she was crossing a line, but she couldn't stop. She took another step closer, not taking her eyes off the sleeping Max. His chest rose and fell with each breath, the rhythm steady and calming. She reached out her hand, her fingers hovering in the air above his skin, feeling the warmth radiating from him. His eyes slowly opened, and for a moment there was confusion in them. But then he saw her and his gaze changed. It became deep, dark, and dangerous, with something she didn't expect at all. Mia! His voice was hoarse, barely audible, but there was a tense strength in it. His fingers gently tightened around her neck, holding her in place. She couldn't look away, couldn't step back. She was caught. "What are you doing?" he asked, and there was a strange undertone in his voice that made Mia shiver. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew she should apologize, explain herself, but she couldn't. She was a captive of his gaze, his touch. Mia couldn't find the words. Inside her, a storm of conflicting emotions raged, but she didn't retreat. Max looked at her, his hand still holding her by the neck, and in his gaze, there was something that made her heart beat faster. "Do you even understand what you're doing to me?" His voice was quiet, but there was restrained power in it. His fingers tightened slightly, and he pulled her closer. Now their faces were just inches apart, their breaths mingling. Mia felt warmth spread throughout her body. She knew she should stop, run away, but she couldn't move. Max leaned in a little closer, his lips touching her ear. "Do you know how long I've wanted this?" he whispered. There was something wild, uncontrollable in his voice that made Mia freeze in shock and confusion. She couldn't believe her ears. "Wanted what?" Her voice was barely audible, almost lifeless from the shock. But instead of answering, Max pulled her even closer, his arm now wrapping around her waist. Mia gasped, her body tensing from surprise and excitement when she found herself pressed against his warmth. Max smiled slightly, his gaze darkening even more. He leaned in, and his lips softly touched hers, plunging her into a kiss that was all-consuming. This was something more than just attraction. The kiss was intense, dominating, and Mia lost her sense of reality. Her mind clouded, and she surrendered to his onslaught, clutching his shirt with her hands, pulling him closer. Max didn't stop, his kisses becoming more insistent, sliding down her neck, making her shiver with each touch. "Max, she tried to say, but he didn't let her finish. His hand slid under her sweater, touching the bare skin of her waist. Mia moaned softly, her back arching as his fingers touched her ribs. Her entire consciousness screamed that this was wrong, that she should stop, but her body craved more. Max froze for a moment, his eyes darkening with passion. "You drive me crazy," he whispered, his voice low and hoarse. He pulled her to him again, his lips everywhere. On her lips, on her neck, teasing her until her head spun. She could no longer resist. Mia surrendered. All her doubts and fears dissolved in the moment when Max leaned in again and enveloped her with new kisses. His lips were soft but insistent, moving across her lips with a hunger that made her heart beat faster. He removed her sweater, and she found herself naked, vulnerable, but at the same time feeling that this was exactly what she had always wanted. Max slowly ran his hands over her shoulders, his fingers lightly sliding over her skin, causing shivers of pleasure. Mia closed her eyes, completely surrendering to his touch. His lips moved lower, leaving a trail of kisses on her neck, collarbone, and then on her chest. She shivered when his tongue lightly touched her skin, sending a wave of warmth through her body. Max continued to explore her body, his hands sliding down her sides, then lower, to her waist. He slowly ran his fingers over her stomach, pausing for a moment before his hands slid lower, to her thighs. Mia felt her body responding to each of his touches, as if it knew that this was exactly what she craved. His lips found her lips again, and he kissed her deeply and passionately, his tongue intertwining with hers in a dance that made her head spin. Mia embraced him, pulling him closer, feeling the warmth of his body, his strength, and his desire. She knew this was wrong, but at that moment, nothing mattered except their closeness. A week after that night, Mia found herself in Max's house again when Valerie was at work. This time, everything happened even faster. They didn't need words, didn't need explanations. Mia knew that she was drawn to Max, and she understood that it was wrong. But inside her was an unquenchable fire that wouldn't let her resist. Max couldn't tear himself away from her. His self-control was completely shattered when they were alone together again. Thus began their secret affair. They met late at night when Valerie was at work or went to visit friends. Every time the house fell silent, Max and Mia found each other. Their accidental night turned into regular meetings, which were no longer accidental. Each touch was deliberate, each word filled with hidden passion. This was not just moments of physical satisfaction. Something deeper, emotional, had arisen between them. Mia felt in these meetings something more than just a secret desire. Her heart began to beat faster every time she approached Max's house, and her thoughts increasingly returned to him, even when they were apart. She knew that these relationships were destructive, that they carried a threat not only to her but also to the entire family. But she could no longer stop. Max had become something irreplaceable for her, something that filled the void inside her. Max, in turn, found in these meetings the comfort that he lacked in his marriage with Valerie. Although he knew that what he and Mia were doing was wrong, his attraction to her was too strong to ignore. They both tried to hide their feelings, not allowing them to go beyond the house. But these secret nights quickly became something more than just casual dates. Their connection increasingly resembled a romance that flared up with each new meeting. Valerie had always been an attentive, perceptive woman who noticed even the smallest changes in her husband's behavior. And it was this that became the cause of her suspicions. At first, it was little things. Max's long glances at Mia, his barely noticeable nervousness when they were together, and how he sometimes avoided unnecessary conversations about her. But over time, it accumulated. Something was not right. One evening, when Max went to take a shower, Valerie sat in the living room and accidentally saw a notification from Mia on his phone. The message was brief. "I miss you," and that night. She knew she shouldn't read her husband's messages, but this message aroused too much suspicion in her. With uncertainty and trembling hands, she took the phone and opened the message. What she saw was like a bolt of lightning. Mia not only wrote Max intimate confessions, but also sent him her nude photos. This was not just flirting, this was a full-fledged affair. Valerie couldn't believe her eyes. Her heart beat faster, her head buzzed. The world she considered safe and stable crumbled in an instant. At that moment, she felt only one thing: anger and betrayal. How could her husband do this? How could Mia betray her like this? When Max came out of the bathroom, Valerie was already sitting in a chair with his phone in her hands. She wasn't crying. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Max immediately sensed that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, looking at Valerie. But instead of an answer, she handed him his phone. "Can you explain something to me?" Her voice was quiet, but there was icy determination in it. She didn't raise her eyes to Max, so as not to reveal how broken she was at that moment. Max looked at the screen and immediately paled. He understood that his secret was revealed, and there was no point in lying anymore. Everything that had been hidden for these months was now laid out before them. "Valerie, he began, but his words sounded weak, unconvincing. Inside him, panic raged, but he understood that all explanations were now useless. "You're cheating on me with Mia," Valerie finally said. Now her voice was harsher, as if she was forcing herself to say it out loud to finally accept the truth. "With your niece, Max. Do you realize what you've done?" Max lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. He understood that no words could explain or justify what had happened. He himself knew this, but inside him was an irresistible force that drew him to Mia. This was more than just attraction. This feeling could not be ignored. "I can't explain this, Valerie," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't plan for this to happen. I myself don't understand how I got to this. But it happened, and Valerie clenched her fists. Her eyes were full of tears, but she didn't intend to cry in front of him. "Do you love her?" she asked, her voice filled with despair. Max froze. He looked at the floor for a long time, not daring to raise his eyes to his wife. But he knew he had to tell the truth, no matter how bitter it was. "Yes," he finally answered, quietly, barely audible, but enough for her to hear. These words sounded like a blow. Valerie turned away, pressing her hand to her mouth to hold back a scream. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. All her life she had devoted to this marriage, to this man whom she loved more than anything in the world, and now he was choosing someone else. Moreover, her niece. "Do you understand that this is the end?" Her voice was muffled, full of suppressed pain. "Do you understand that with this you have destroyed everything that was between us?" Max knew this. He felt it with every word that Valerie spoke. But he also knew that he could not live without Mia. It seemed to him that this feeling overshadowed everything. He tried to fight it, tried to ignore it, but it was stronger than him. "I understand, Valerie," he said, "but I can't go back. I can't change what I feel. You choose her, not me." Her voice was full of bitterness. She tried to accept this, tried to find the strength to let him go. But it turned out to be much harder than she thought. Max was silent. He knew that any of his words would be superfluous. In this choice, there were no winners. Everything was destroyed. Valerie looked at him one last time. Her eyes no longer filled with love, only pain and despair. She knew that this marriage could not be restored. She headed for the door but stopped for a moment, without turning around. "You've lost not only me, Max. You've lost the family." With these words, Valerie left the room, leaving him alone in the oppressive silence. Valerie hesitated for a long time before deciding to tell Mia's parents the truth. After discovering the betrayal and facing the infidelity of Max and Mia, her world collapsed. She spent several days trying to find the strength and a solution, not knowing how to act correctly. But the feeling of anger and pain took over. Valerie realized that if she didn't tell them, everything could go further, destroying their family even more. She called Mia's parents, asking them to meet her at their house. When they gathered in the living room, Valerie, with a voice full of bitterness, told them everything. About Mia's affair with Max, their secret meetings, and what she had discovered by accidentally seeing the correspondence on her husband's phone. Mia's father sat in complete silence, his face tense and grim. Her mother, on the other hand, could not hold back her tears, her hands trembling. They could not believe that their daughter, their smart, sensible Mia, could be involved in such a relationship. When Mia returned home, they were waiting for her. The atmosphere in the house was heavy, almost unbearable. Her father sat with a grim face, not saying a word, and her mother was on the verge of tears, looking into the void. Mia immediately felt that something was wrong. When she entered the living room, her father raised his gaze. His face was grim, his eyes burning with anger, but he restrained his emotions. He gestured to the sofa, asking her to sit down. Mia knew that this moment would come sooner or later. She felt the weight of what was happening in the air, but she could not avoid this conversation. Her heart beat fast, her breath quickened. She sat down on the sofa, waiting for her father to speak. "Is it true?" he finally asked. "What Valerie said, is it true? Are you seeing Max?" The silence in the room was deafening. Mia was silent, knowing that lying was pointless. She lowered her eyes, not daring to meet her father's gaze. But her silence spoke for her. Her father, not waiting for an answer, stood up from the chair, striking the back of the chair with such force that it shook. "How could you do this?" His voice trembled with anger. "Do you understand what you've done? Max is your uncle and you disgust me." Mia struggled to hold back her tears, but she could not make herself say anything. At that moment, her mother, who had been silent all this time, quietly said, almost without looking at her daughter, "We always trusted you, Mia. We raised you better. How could you betray us like this?" Her voice was full of pain, disappointment, not anger. These words caused Mia even more suffering than her father's shouts. Her mother had always been her support, and now this fragile bridge between them was crumbling before her eyes. "Do you understand that this is wrong?" Her father spoke again, his voice loud. "You must end this relationship. Immediately." Mia knew that this request was her parents' last attempt to save the situation, but she could not retreat. She was too deeply involved in her feelings for Max, and although she was torn by contradictions inside, she had made her choice. "I can't, Dad," she whispered, barely finding the strength to speak. Her father's words pierced her heart, each one a blow. She was silent, not knowing what to answer. Everything she felt was a mix of guilt, pain, and determination. She knew that what she had done was wrong in the eyes of her parents, but her love for Max was real, and giving it up would be impossible. These relationships seemed like the only right choice, despite their destructive consequences. Her father continued to shout, and Mia could no longer bear his accusations. Inside her, everything tightened. She realized that this conversation was destroying their family, that her parents would never accept her relationship with Max. Their bond with her parents, which had seemed so strong, was breaking before her eyes. When her father, in desperation, said that they no longer considered her their daughter if she chose Max, Mia felt her inner world finally crumbling. She stood before a choice that she could not make, family or love. And although her heart was breaking with pain, she understood that there was no choice. She chose Max. After the truth came out, Mia and Max could no longer stay in that city. Their relationship had destroyed everything. Family, trust, the very foundation of their lives. They decided to leave to start everything anew, far from those who judged them. Their new home was in a quiet, remote town where no one knew them. This place became their refuge, where they could live without judgment and the eyes of people who knew their story. The first months were filled with mixed feelings. On the one hand, Mia and Max enjoyed the freedom they had found far from everyone. They built their lives anew, step by step, arranging their home and trying to forget the pain they had left behind. Mia got a job in a bookstore and Max started repairing furniture. Outwardly, their life seemed calm, but inside both of them, doubts and regrets continued to gnaw. Mia could not stop thinking about her parents. Every evening, when she was alone, her thoughts returned to those last words from her father and mother. She felt that she had torn apart the bond that was most important to her, but she could no longer fix it. Sometimes she wanted to call them, apologize, but she knew that it would change nothing. Max was also immersed in his own thoughts. He loved Mia, but his marriage with Valerie was destroyed, and with it everything he knew about his life. He understood that his choice had serious consequences, and despite being happy with Mia, it was hard for him to accept that he had caused pain to others. Rumors in their new town began to spread. The locals, noticing their strange relationship, began to ask questions. Gossip that Max and Mia were not just uncle and niece began to reach them. This added additional tension to their lives. Mia often wondered if they had done the right thing by running away. Now they were safe, but that didn't mean everything else had disappeared. Deep down, she knew that this burden would always accompany her. One evening, when they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Mia, leaning on Max's shoulder, quietly asked, "Do you regret it?" Max looked at her, and although his answer was quick and confident, his eyes betrayed his inner struggle. "Not for a second," he said, trying to smile. But both knew that their lives had changed forever,